Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm going to take a look at the astrology of December 2020. So this is our last month of 2020. I can hardly believe it. It's been like the longest and most intense year in my 10-year career of doing astrology. And I know you all have been along for the ride as well in your own personal lives, all of us. Um, I've never also seen as many dramatic twists and turns in my clients' lives. This year has just been intense, both collectively and personally, as far as I can tell. Um, so we're going to take a look at the last month of the year. There's a lot of things happening this month. We've got an eclipse. We've got Jupiter and Saturn conjoining in Aquarius. We have a bunch of little known anticia aspects that are happening, which you probably heard me talk about very recently. We have Mars squaring Pluto again. So it's full on. There's actually a bunch of aspects with Neptune this month as well. So should be pretty fascinating. Now, before I get into it, I just want to remind everybody that my Kickstarter is running between now and New Year's Eve. We are trying to beat last year's goal of 690 backers. We're at 180 today, about 3 or 4 days in. So we're doing really well. We're off to a great start, but I still need your support. So if you haven't chipped in already, I'd really appreciate it. If you appreciate this channel, if you watch it regularly, semi-regularly, you share it, the insights stick with you, you learn new things. I put a ton of heart and soul into this. This occupies a majority of my day every single day, preparing for creating these. And if you want to learn more about the process that I take to create all of this content, if you go to my Kickstarter, you can also watch a video and I kind of show you everything that goes into it as well. So, and when you donate, you can pick up a bunch of different rewards. There are exclusive readings and lectures and things like that. There's also over 50% off to all of my online courses for 2021. So if you were thinking, hey, I want to take Acyuta's class in the spring or maybe next fall, either way, you can use the reward to attend one of my Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic online training programs or my year 2 or advanced horary programs. So check all of that out. I really appreciate your support. The link is in the comments section if you need to find it there. Okay, so all that being said, let's pop up the real-time clock and take a look at what's going on. So we're going to go, we're just going to kind of go day by day through the month. And as always, I highlight the transits that I think are going to be the most impactful. I don't necessarily cover every single transit. If there's one I missed that you feel like is really important, I'd love to hear your interpretation. Feel free to leave it in the comments section. Let's go ahead. I've got December 1st pulled up here. And the thing that I want to draw our attention to is between the 1st and the 6th, you're going to see Mercury going through a series of anticia to Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto. So let's just move this forward just a touch so we get Mercury into Sagittarius. Now, and if you don't know what an anticia is, earlier this week, I did a video on anticia with the sun. So if you go to the video that says the sun making anticias or forming anticia to Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto, watch that video. I explain what an anticia is so that you can understand it. Anyway, here is Mercury entering Sagittarius on December 1st, going into the sign of Jupiter. In Sagittarius, where Mercury is in its detriment. So and it's now getting under the beams of the sun, into the combustion zone, getting pretty close to that. So Mercury is getting a little bit weaker. And Mercury is now in the hands of Jupiter, who is still in his fall. And Mercury is going into the secretive anticia conjunction with Saturn, and then Jupiter, and then Pluto. And this trifecta of aspects is happening between the 1st and the 6th of the month. So what could you anticipate from this? Well, one thing when it comes to Mercury and anticia is that it definitely it heightens that sense of something secretive. We have Mercury invisible behind the beams under the beams of the sun. Mercury is the planet that dips and dives in and out of invisibility in the underworld, more than any other planet. And along, I guess you could say, along with the moon, which is always goes through a dark phase once a month. But Mercury changes from visible to invisible, evening star to morning star, and back really frequently. And Mercury can be, Hermes can be very sneaky, and has a way of moving through places that are seen and unseen. You think, for example, about the simple feature of gossip. How many times a day do we talk about someone or something that isn't present before us? The words that we say don't always, the effects of the words that we say when someone or something isn't present around us don't always appear to us right away. But anybody who survived grade school, junior high, high school, knows that words that you say when people aren't there in front of you have a way of getting misconstrued, misinterpreted. The gossip goes around, and it does have a consequence. I'm just using that as a metaphor, you could say, or kind of an analogy to what happens when Mercury's in these anticias. Mercury, as a planet of invisibility, might be bringing things together that we don't see right away. And I would anticipate, even given that the anticia aren't a typical aspect, that they're not a visible ray connecting the planets. In fact, in traditional astrology, these signs are in aversion to one another. And yet these connections are being made while Mercury's under the beams of the sun. I would anticipate that it's possible that things are going to be glossed over, or that we're going to try to hide things, or that things that are discovered are not necessarily going to be spoken about until later. Now, this could, mean a whole bunch of different things. For example, let's just say that you're looking over a contract. You take a look at the contract and you don't really read it carefully, right? So this would be kind of glossing over something. And then later, suddenly you get to, crossing the T's and dotting the I's and actually signing off on the thing, and you notice it. And then everything changes because suddenly you notice something that before was hidden, or that you weren't paying attention to, or you're somehow glossing over. The bottom line of Mercury Saturn could be, in at least the first couple of days of December, could have to do with really looking at things that need to be like kind of hard bottom lines that somehow have been invisible to us, or that we've been missing somehow. Or that could be that there's impediments that are coming up, or harder truths that we're having to meet and recognize. And maybe there's a history there, or maybe there's some level of denial or secretiveness. That's just something to keep your eye on in the early stages of the month. The one that I'm more concerned about, though, is the conversation that Mercury is going to have with Jupiter. Mercury in Jupiter's power, and Jupiter being in its fall, sandwiched between Saturn and Pluto, that's rough, because you've got a Mercury that's being burnt up in its detriment, and Pluto in Jupiter's sign, and Jupiter's a little bit messed up. So I would think of, for example, the potential for something really overstated or exaggerated, something pompous or puffed up to occur, or for information to get exaggerated or inflated to some epic proportions. Those are all Mercury in the hands, kind of a messed up Mercury in the hands of a messed up Jupiter. Some information, communication, idea it's compounded, all right, by the way that Jupiter tends to make things a lot bigger, and not in such a great way when it's in the sign of its fall. And also, because Mercury is going to move through the anticia with Pluto, there's something really subterranean about all of this. So, for example, one of the things that you think about is, let's say that someone comes to assess a problem, like a contractor comes to take a look at a problem, and they say, yeah, it's going to be easy to fix. It'll cost you this much money. They come back, and then they take a look at it again. And all of a sudden they say, oh, actually, there's all of these other problems, and it's going to be a lot more money. And suddenly something has been revealed, and it's a lot bigger of an issue than you thought it was going to be. Those would all be real possibilities, as would the potential that contractor is somehow being dishonest and making up or inflating the nature of what's been found. Like when you go, I have mechanics in my family, so I mean, no disrespect to mechanics, but you have probably had a mechanic at some point that has found ways of charging you more for something that you went in to fix that was quite simple. I need a new battery, or you know what I mean? Something, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, you need a new engine. And you're like, wait, what? So watch for that kind of dynamic. I'm also the potential here for people to get really, what do I want to say, zealous about things, because Mercury, a little bit of a burnt up Mercury, really inflamed in a fire sign with fallen Jupiter, with Pluto and Saturn. I think about disinformation and propaganda, and I think about people potentially getting really rigid and dogmatic or zealous about things, at least for a little temporary period of time as Mercury's going through these anticia. So those are some of the things that come to mind. The other thing is that you could just think generally Mercury stuff might get a little bit jacked up. Mercury stuff could include communication, technology, speech, learning, writing, anything related to bartering or trading, or anything where there's kind of like Mercury rules marketplaces. So anything where there's an exchange of goods, services, ideas, you want to be careful around this time. This would be not a good time, for example, to get into a legal fight with somebody. It's not a good, like, inceptional look for the start of a legal battle. I wouldn't like this chart very much. And people could also tend to, bring like trumped up charges or something like that, where, there's a way of trying to get something done by hurling a lot at somebody. And sometimes, when we overwhelm somebody with something, or so many things all at once, they're likely to give in and give us at least something that we want, because they're overwhelmed by so many things at once. So getting overwhelmed and feeling like you're in a compromised position because you're just trying to get out of overwhelm and you end up kind of giving too much, that would be something else that I would watch for around this. You just are looking for a way out. You want to get something done, so you're willing to make some kind of compromise because the heat's on. You know what I mean? So watch for that around the first week of the month. Now, during this time, the other reason that I think we have to be very careful about some elements of secretiveness, shadiness, coercion, manipulation, etc., is because on December 5th, we're also going to see a debilitated Venus in a trine with Neptune. Now, Venus-Neptune trines aren't the worst thing in the world. You think it kind of has a seductive, romantic, it's sort of sublime, Venus-Neptune. It's an aura of, oftentimes it's kind of, you think of the word enthusiasm, entheos, the God within. There's a feeling of being seduced by spirits and by, moods and atmospheres. And it's it's just a really romantic kind of transit. But because you have Venus debilitated in a Mars-ruled sign, Venus in Scorpio, one of the things that can happen to Venus in Scorpio, especially because, look, what's happening? Mars is getting into it with Pluto. That's Venus's host. Venus in Mars's sign is not in her comfort zone. When you then have Mars moving into the square with Pluto, you think about people trying to get things done in ways that are very coercive and manipulative, but also the underlying motivation is strength, power, domination, competition. There's hostility underneath the surface, but Venus-Neptune might bring that across in a way that's pretty seductive. So that's something to keep your eye on, and it's happening at the same time that Mercury is going through the anticias with these three planets. So, and remember, anticias have always had an aura of it's not every single time that you see an anticia it means something secretive, but there can be something a little bit more, a little less on the surface about it. It's a little underneath the surface. Sometimes it's unconscious or unseen or invisible. So there's a lot of that at the beginning of the month that I'm really just keeping my eye on. Now, what is this followed up by? Again, on the 9th, you got another Neptune aspect. Now, this is just after the Venus-Neptune trine is separating, but you have Mars increasing, getting closer to the square to Pluto. Now, Mars-Pluto is really explosive and cathartic, but it has a lot to do with will and dominance and competition and things like that. And the sun is going through a square to Neptune. Mercury is going to do the square to Neptune as well. And the square from Mercury to Neptune, let's see, where does that come in? Move this forward just a bit. Yeah, the square comes in around December 13th. So, you know, from the 9th to the 13th, there's two more pretty powerful aspects from the sun and Mercury to Neptune. So you have the same thing happening. Now, again, I don't mean to paint Neptune as just this totally deceptive planet, but given the fact that Mars is applying to Pluto, that Venus is in Scorpio, you just get the feeling of like, be really careful about how you're trying to go about getting things done this month, because the temptation to do things in a more underhanded, covert, secretive manner, or to try to get away with things, or to look one way on the surface, but your motivations or intentions are different behind the surface or below the surface. That's all. I think it's really important to stay aware of that as a possibility this month. Now, we will get out of the weeds because there's some really big changes that happen later in the month that are going to shift the dynamic of the whole month entirely, especially Jupiter and Saturn leaving Capricorn. But up until this point, to me, it looks a lot like there are going to be difficult choices and compromises, and we may not feel clear, or we may not have all the information, or we may feel like people or situations are maybe trying to take advantage of us, or we could fall prey to trying to cut in corners that are really important not to cut for the sake of integrity and karma in the long run. So anyway, now the Sun square Neptune, another nice thing about this is that we are starting to get a new vision, and there is this sense of, I mean, here we have, you know, the sun coming across the south node. It's about to form an eclipse with the south node, and it's in Jupiter's sign, and Jupiter is about to switch dignity. To me, this also speaks to a new vision and a new level of inspiring insight. You think kind of the miraculous epiphany. You think of like a person being pulled out of the water after they're baptized with the sun Neptune, and just, it's like, I'm reborn. And there's a sense of healing and clarity and inspiration, and even that sense of heroic or divine calling or mission. You get those feelings from the sun Neptune. And Mercury Neptune is also, can be very otherworldly. I remember some years ago when Robert Schmidt, who I consider to be one of my teachers in this lifetime, he passed away, and I was there when he passed away. I spent a little bit of time in the hospital room when he was there, and Mercury was squaring Neptune, and it was the passage, the passage of this great teacher. And he had spent a lot of his life talking about Hermes, Mercury. So there was Mercury square Neptune, and he was, you know, in another state of consciousness, you know, on, you know, basically getting ready to leave his body. Weirdly enough, there were so many like epiphanies and aha moments that I had, because I was sitting there watching a teacher that was very dear to me for a number of different reasons. I just really loved his mind, especially, and there he was, you know, leaving his body. So sometimes there's also going to be some sense of the dissolution of something or someone, the passing of something or someone, and then the inspiration that floods in. Let me carry on a legacy. The baton is being passed from one person to another, or one generation to another. And the sense of this being a divine moment that starts to clear the clouds of haze and confusion. It's not so important what happened in the past, or how it happened, or why it happened, or if we have been hurt or betrayed or misled or deceived. this could also be a clarifying moment where we suddenly say, it doesn't matter because this has been clarifying somehow. The confusion is now leading to some sense of faith in what comes next, and some sense of divine order in all of this, in all of the confusion, and in potential lack of clarity that the earlier transits in the month that I've talked about show. This transit can also suddenly peel the clouds back, and the sun is coming through, which is a weird thing about the sun and Neptune in general, because a lot of people think sun Neptune, they can think of heroic delusions of grandeur, and that can be a thing too. But there's also a weird way in which sun Neptune has to do with the disillusionment and at the same time some sense of divine inspiration. So now let's go forward a little bit further in the month, and let's go to the 14th. And this is what I'm talking about, right? Because there's more evidence to the same point, which is that you have a solar eclipse coming through on December 14th in Sagittarius. Now, why is that so remarkable? Because it's in Jupiter's sign, it's in Jupiter's power, right? So Jupiter's in its fall. But what is Jupiter about to do? Well, Jupiter on the 16th, right? On the 16th, then I'll just go forward one more day. You're going to have Saturn enter Aquarius, right? So Saturn enters Aquarius on the 16th, and then Jupiter is going to follow the next day on the 17th. Let's go one more here. Here we go. See, I wrote it down wrong. Hold on. So it officially crosses in on the 19th. Sorry. So you have that couple of days there between the 16th and the 19th where Jupiter and Saturn move into Aquarius. Now, that's important for a number of different reasons. First of all, Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions are somewhat rare. They only happen, every 20, their synodic cycle is like 20 years. It's also unique because it takes a long time. I'm doing a separate video series on Jupiter-Saturn, so this is just sort of a sneak peek, but it takes a long time for Saturn and Jupiter's conjunctions to change elemental families. They're just moving into the air signs. And that's a big deal. That shifts the mood significantly of the times that we're living in. Jupiter, Saturn are like markers of major collective and generational changes. Okay, so now the reason that I'm saying that this is a big deal is because here you have a solar eclipse in Jupiter's sign, which means Jupiter is toning it. And it's not just any Jupiter, it's a fallen Jupiter that is suddenly about to sort of rise out of the ashes of poor dignity and conjoin Saturn in the sign of the water bearer, an air sign, and a sign that suggests a big lift for Jupiter. And this is coming as the sun is also, this conjunction is coming as the sun is also cazimi with Mercury right around the winter solstice. December 21st, the winter solstice comes in, and Jupiter and Saturn get together. Meanwhile, there's a celebratory feeling in the air because just prior to this is what's so interesting. All right, so just prior to this, as all of this is happening, Venus, goddess of good fortune, pops into Jupiter's sign in Sagittarius, just as they're conjoining and changing signs. So you have, and then what is she doing just as she enters? Hitting an anticia with these planets again. So that's really interesting because you have this planet that's associated with good fortune just after a solar eclipse signifying a new beginning. And you have those signals of new beginning happening just as Jupiter is picking up a whole bunch of dignity and moving out of fallen Capricorn. You get the feeling of some kind of rebirth or reset, and it's a big one. It's significant historically, and it's going to be very fortunate, but there's some things that are going to be a part of this that are really unexpected this month that come out of the blue. And I think a part of it is because there's a lot going on behind the scenes with a bunch of anticias this month, all leaning towards a messed up Jupiter that could really hurt things, but then somehow turns this big corner and starts providing us with a new vision and a new, like a breath of fresh air somehow. Wow, really, really, really interesting stuff. I can't like this. Uh, at the beginning of the year, when I do my overview for the year ahead, this month and last month were two of the biggest that I had circled, in addition to the earlier part of the year when Saturn and Pluto got together. But I didn't think coming into this month that I would be as excited as I am, because one of the things that I really wasn't paying attention to were the anticia. So that's been an addition to my way of thinking about this month that's got me pretty excited about where all this is heading. So how would I translate all of this? I once was lost, but now I'm found. That's the kind of feeling that I get from the mid-month turnaround. Once Jupiter hits Aquarius, it's as though there's this profound new sense of beginning that's happening, and it's a collective thing, but it's also going to be very personal. One thing that we're going to do in the series that I'll make on Jupiter and Saturn will be to take it through the houses and talk about what kind of new beginning can you expect, especially given the combination of Sagittarius in the solar eclipse in Sagittarius ruled by Jupiter. All of the anticias this month in Sagittarius ruled by Jupiter. The solar, again, and Venus at the tail end here, the goddess of good fortune, hitting an anticia with Jupiter and Saturn, and then boom, they change signs. There's something about this encounter with Venus this month that makes me think the feminine, women, the goddess, sexuality, something around harmonization of different elements, and some stroke of good luck or grace is going to come in and really be a game changer. And this is from, I would say, the 14th new moon all the way up until about the let's say the 21st on the winter solstice. Like that period of time is like, it's going to be really interesting to see how Venus plays a role in that in particular. Well, the Venus anticia with Pluto should also be interesting, because there's this complete and total deep transformation that Venus will go through when she hits the anticia with Pluto, which will also happen right on the winter solstice as Jupiter and Saturn are conjoining in Aquarius. Let's talk just a little bit more about the Jupiter, Saturn, and Aquarius motif. I'm going to go into this, like I said, in greater depth in a series that I'm doing on these two planets, so I'll save it. But the first thing to note is that in medieval astrology, and to a certain extent even dating farther back, Jupiter is associated with spring and with new life, and Kronos, Saturn, with old age. And this is pretty easy to understand. Saturn represents the ruler of the golden age. Jupiter is the Jupiter is the sun that overtakes Kronos. So you have the idea of the old man and the young man, or the old person and the younger generation. When they come together, there's often this feeling of a new epoch or a new era in our lives, where wisdom, lessons learned, maturity, rank, status, mastery gained starts translating into tangible results, where you're going to see this idea of the enthusiasm and inspiration that comes into our life in some particular area and says, new, let's go. And it's going to be hard work, Saturn, but there's a lot of enthusiasm, Jupiter, to do something completely different. It's also a meeting of the more mature qualities with the more, let's say, inspired and youthful qualities. And those coming together in a new air sign, it's not just that it's all, people love to idealize Aquarius. We're going to hopefully talk about why Aquarius is really interesting and fun, and also knock it down a peg from the woo-woo, because people get into Aquarius, like the age of Aquarius and all this kind of stuff. We're going to talk about all of that. But one thing that I will say is that the thing that makes this so potent is that you're getting a totally different kind of Saturnine vibe than you do in Capricorn. Both Saturn ruled signs in ancient astrology, but Aquarius is a very different kind of Saturn. But more than that, it's Jupiter leaving its fall. When Jupiter leaves its fall, it no longer is a badly debilitated Jupiter. And so we're going to see the Jupiter that we know and love a little bit more coming back. And for most people, that's going to mean a feeling of redemption, of restored faith, of a new vision for the future, of the feeling of being ready to start over and press reset after long, hard tribulations and challenges. A little bit of that feeling of having persevered and gone through something and having to kind of keep the faith through the heaviness of doubts and and darkness. That when Jupiter moves into Aquarius, some of that's going to lift just by nature of the dignity change. So that's a big deal. Now, one of the things that's really interesting is that right away as they enter, they're going to be going into a square with Uranus. Now, this is something that'll unfold over 2021, but Jupiter Uranus is all about breakthroughs. Like if you think about people defying records, breaking like records, like faster than the speed of sound in an airplane, or, the death-defying, extreme sports maneuvers, or like record breaking, anything that would be record breaking. Well, and also the idea of a kind of potential like things going crazy, like Bitcoin or certain technologies or cryptocurrencies, or people getting really, really inspired by something and possibly getting like almost like going to the supermarket with an empty stomach. You buy everything because you're so hungry. This has the buyer beware in 2021 of the inspiration is so much that it's like it's like Icarus. You fly too high toward the sun and you get burned. But Saturn is there in the mix and will quickly clip wings if it's doing that, or will quickly demonstrate that there's something fanatical or unrealistic here, or will emphasize that some of the enthusiasm is bordering on zealousness, fanaticism, etc. So we have this real push-pull between the really expansive, exciting Jupiter Uranus and the more contractive, conservative Saturn qualities that are going to be on display. And you'll feel it right away, actually. And we could see some of those things even in December. But the initial just, hello, let's get a few planets out of Capricorn. That's going to feel really great to people. And it's going to have a big impact on your birth chart regardless, because when planets ingress and change signs, you really feel it. It doesn't even matter if it's hitting planets in your chart or not. Ingresses into new houses in ancient astrology were a big deal. So we'll go through the house positions when we do that series. Now, as if that isn't enough, just days after the winter solstice and the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, we are seeing Mars in Aries making the square to Pluto. Now that's that volcanic eruptive level of Mars force kind of coming up from the underworld. It's the power to get things done. It's the power to move through an obstacle. It's a heroic display of force and strength and might. It's also the potential for bullying or strong arming or trying to murder and steal to get what you want. Like the ruthlessness of that transit is a real thing too. But it's also a great cathartic moment. We have to be really careful around this time for, for example, I would imagine that Mars Pluto will show up as, something in the world of athletes, something in the world of warfare, something around guns, something around violence. I mean, that stuff is going to be there. But this is also a moment where if you've been waiting for something to happen and you've been waiting on it, especially since last June, as long as Mars has been in Aries, this is a moment of catharsis for a lot of people. It's going to be like that, of moving through something that you've been waiting on back since June and way before the Mars retrograde. It's like the grand finale for Mars and Aries in a sense. It's it's going to change out in the new year into Taurus, where it then immediately enters into squares with Jupiter, Saturn in a conjunction with Uranus. That's really the astrological story of January in some ways. We'll come to that later. But final thing that I think is worth mentioning, at the very end of the month, we're going to see a full moon in Cancer, which I like just as a softening effect toward the very end of the month. There's a real soft energy, and there's something probably, I think that you could see the end of the year wrapping up with an emphasis on things like family, home. There's emotional unity that's calling out to us with the full moon in Cancer at the very end of the month. And so even though the earlier part of the month feels more like a thriller and maybe even like a spy novel or something, there's a lot of like kind of and it feels like really there's a lot of kind of revolutionary transits in the air, but you bring it back to the home and hearth, to the sweetness and emotional concern and connectedness of the full moon in Cancer at the end of the month on the 29th. And it also has this feeling of sweetness that's coming on the 30th as Venus is also going through a square to Neptune. I like that better than what I was seeing with Venus trining Neptune in Scorpio at the beginning of the month, because they're both in Jupiter signs. Jupiter's just had this big bump, and I think it's harder in some ways for us to be deluded by the squares than it is the trines with Neptune and Venus. But that's kind of just a theory of mine. But here you have just, again, kind of a romantic and dreamy and just a very pleasant looking Venus square to Neptune. It could be filled with the joy and enthusiasm of the new Jupiter energy. And I think that that's probably good. And I like that set alongside of, a pretty nice looking full moon in Cancer. So the full moon in Cancer, it's not so close to Pluto that it worries me. And as it grows during that transit, as the moon goes through Cancer, it hits a lot of pretty constructive aspects overall. Toward the very end of that transit going to the new year, it's going to hit the Pluto Mars dynamic temporarily. It could be a little bit of messiness, but I like the end of the month anyway. It's just kind of a softening effect at the very end. So that's my take on December. I like to just kind of lay it out, look at it overall, give you a feeling for it, give you a sense of what kind of things I have my eye on. And then as the month goes on, what I typically do, if you're new to my channel, is I break down each transit. We take a look at each transit as they're going, and we sort of unpack it and offer more, accessible personal interpretations, collective reflections, and so forth. But for now, I'd love to hear what you guys think about this. When you hear about these transits overall for the month of December, what are you thinking? How are you already seeing this potentially playing out in your own life? Try to keep it clean and nice. I tend to delete things that are really inflammatory, just so you guys know. Otherwise, also stay tuned. I'm putting this out early because I'm going to do the lunar eclipse in Gemini video at the end of this week. And of course, there's Thanksgiving here, so I just have like a kind of a short thing that I'm doing for Thanksgiving. And then next week on Monday, we're putting out sun rising sign horoscopes for January. So you'll get those sun rising sign horoscope, or for December. So you'll get those sun rising sign horoscopes as well. Last but not least, we are closing in on 200 backers. We need 20 more to get there. Let's see if we can get there today. I would love your support. If you enjoy this channel, anything that you can pitch in is really helpful. Of course, you can pick up a lot of awesome rewards too that I only give out at this time of year. So thank you for your support, and I hope you guys have a really great day. All right, bye.